I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of fishing in Astoria. The title of this presentation is Work is Our Joy, Maritime Labor on the Columbia River. We talked about earlier in the term about the Chinook Indians being the first people to live in this area, and they were people who fished for salmon, husbands and wives fishing together. The salmon were so plentiful at that time. As Ezra Meeker commented, I have seen the salmon so numerous at the shoal water of the channel as to literally touch each other. It was utterly impossible to wade across without touching the fish. Lewis and Clark said, we found such a multitude of fish as to be almost inconceivable. The water is so clear that they can readily be seen at a depth of 115 or 120 feet, but at this season they float in such quantities down the stream the Indians have only to collect, split, and dry them on scaffolds. And yet, anthropologists Campbell and Butler recorded that 7,500 years of Chinook Indians fishing on the Columbia River did not result in any loss of salmon numbers. The fishery was sustainable. To be able to fish for that many years, that many generations, and not put a dent in the fish is truly remarkable. We see a beautiful canoe getting ready to perhaps go out and fish. A photograph showing in the 1800s men, women, families fishing together on the Columbia River using nets as their ancestors did. A little further upriver, Celilo Falls, catching them in dip nets in the falls on scaffolding that they built. This shows Chinook Indians celebrating this salmon harvest. The first salmon has been caught, and they're going to eat it and celebrate it in a great feast. It's a time of great joy for them. This point is critical. The Indians had their own technology and the motivation to hunt far beyond their own needs for consumption, so what stopped them from doing so? In other words, why didn't they fish into extermination? Because a spiritual and taboo system emphasizing respect, propitiation, fear, and balance. So in other words, they created a religion and a system that would help to preserve the fish for future generations. And then the white people showed up. This engraving showing the Lady Washington, which we talked about early in the term, coming up the Columbia River. We know in Astoria in 1811, Fort Astoria was built, and it was mainly a trading center for furs. Fishing wasn't such a big deal in those days, but it was a trading center for furs where the white people would trade different trinkets to the Indians in exchange for furs, and they'll sell those at a great profit. And there was a time right around the War of 1812 when this land where we live now was owned by the British, and Fort Astoria at that time was known as Fort George. And guess where it was located? In the middle of what is now Astoria. In the late 1800s, immigration started in a big way, and many thousands of immigrants came from many different places, but especially from Scandinavia. And here we see some Scandinavian immigrants coming. And they brought with them their tradition of fishing, which they had had back in Europe. And this fishing fleet, I love this photograph. These are called butterfly boats because of the shape of the nets. These were early gill netter boats where the men had to row before motors were invented, and they started fishing on the Columbia River, amazed at how many salmon they were able to get so easily. It's hard for us to imagine how many salmon they caught in those days, the Scandinavians, but as you can see from these pictures, the salmon were much bigger in those days. Can you imagine catching a 74-pound Chinook salmon? We see a group of fishermen back in the day rounding up their net, their seine, filled with salmon. Sometimes the haul was so heavy that they used horses to pull in the fishing nets, and these were called the seining ponies. You can see in the left in the background a tall ship there, but they're out in the Columbia River fishing, and they're using horses to haul in the fish. I think that's a neat picture. This is a very early fish processing plant on the Columbia River, and if you look out where we live now, you see pilings all over the place, and most of those were fish processing plants. Astoria, Oregon is the birthplace of fish canning. Up until that time, fish were smoked or put on ice. But in the late 1800s, fish canning was invented in Astoria, and so now you see hundreds of cannery buildings up and down the river to can the salmon. I was reading that they would catch and collect so many fish in one day, it was impossible to can it all the day that it was caught, so they would simply dump the dead ones back into the river and wait for fresh ones the next day. Large amount of waste. Scandinavian ladies were often the ones who worked in the canneries in those days, the fish canneries. I think they are pasting on labels here. The men caught the fish and the ladies worked in the canneries. You see, as it gets mechanized over time, I think this is in the 40s, more and more cans, more and more salmon being exported all over the world now. Look at this, 2.5 million cans of salmon getting ready to be shipped out. Bumblebee Tuna was one of the early companies. Bumblebee Seafoods, their cannery, the big cannery they had was out where Pier 39 is right now. If you've ever been to Coffee Girl, you've been into the place where Bumblebee Seafoods used to be housed. The next wave of immigrants to come in the early 1900s were the Chinese, who came to work in the canneries. They were not allowed to fish. This man was actually breaking the law here. It was thought that only men and only white men could fish, and the Chinese could be beaten up or even mysteriously disappear if they thought they could earn a living fishing. Horrible example of racism in our community. So they were allowed to work in the canneries because it was a more feminine, less manly occupation. So at this point, the Scandinavian women stepped away, some of them, and the Chinese men who immigrated from China came to work in the canneries. The labels from this time period are quite beautiful and colorful. I love this, showing the fisherman's boat on the left. They all have the name Astoria. I've seen, I don't know, 50 different versions of these labels, canning labels. If you see here on the bottom of this label, it says Union Fishermen's Cooperative Packing Company. This is an interesting thing that happened in the early 1900s. The Finnish fishermen got tired of paying such a high price to the canneries to can their fish that they decided to set up their own cannery. So the fishermen actually owned their own cannery so they could keep more of the profits, which is a very almost communist way of looking at things, which comes from their culture and their background in Finland. See Fort George, I think, there. And then, of course, all things come to an end. And when you overfish that long and that seriously, you can see that the salmon started to decline right about World War II. The fishing numbers went down and down. Instead of catching 1 million fish in a year, catching much smaller numbers. Why did the fishery decline? There's a lot of different answers and it's complicated. Overfishing is certainly one of the reasons. Logging, which causes a loss of spawning grounds when gravel and mud slide down a logging site into the river and make it hard for the fish to breed. Farming has caused problems because of the chemical runoff, and that includes the farms in the Willamette Valley, where their poisonous pesticides and herbicides go into the Willamette River and then eventually hit the Columbia. There are 14 dams along the Columbia River, which makes it hard for the salmon to reach their spawning grounds. There's a certain amount of nuclear waste. For example, Fukushima in Japan had a nuclear meltdown and some of their waste has ended up in our waters. Ocean pollution is certainly a problem, especially plastic, and climate change. If you ask the fishermen, they will tell you, some of them will tell you that the sea lions are part of the problem. The California sea lions who are multiplying in great numbers, and they do eat salmon, and they will sometimes take a salmon out of a fisherman's net or off the hook and eat it. Some white fishermen will blame the Native Americans and say that their protected fishing rights are causing the problems, but they actually only harvest a very tiny percentage of the fish. So there's had to have been a change in our culture in our local area now that fishing is not quite what it was back in the day. And there is still fishing. Fishing is still very important to Astoria's economy, but it's nothing like it was. So the Native Americans, for example, instead of feeding their families with their salmon harvest, turned to other kinds of money-making endeavors such as owning casinos. And I love the expression on her face. She's basically saying, you screwed us over for so many years, we're going to get you right back. I just love the expression on her face. Instead of the commercial fishing, you're more likely to meet someone who is a charter fisherman who runs a charter boat, and tourists will come here and catch salmon. But notice how much smaller they are than the earlier hauls and fewer numbers. If you're from Astoria, you recognize this, an old bow picker, an old fishing boat made into a fish and chip shop down by the water. And I have to say, their fish is excellent. I love it. This is a beautiful site, and a place where it used to be a cannery is now the Cannery Pier Hotel. Some fish is still processed in Astoria and Warrenton, but not as much as before. But you can stay in a hotel that still kind of captures the flavor of the old cannery days. The old Lady Washington is rotten and gone. I think she actually sank off the coast of Hawaii, but we have the replica, as I mentioned, week 1, and she still tours up and down the river on occasion. This is a restored, not a replica, but a restored paddle boat from the 1800s. This is the kind of boat that immigrants might have taken to come to Astoria. In the side of the old Fort Astoria or Fort George Fort, we now have Fort George Brewery and Public House where they make beer, and it's a great place to hang out with friends. Where the Chinese labor used to live down on Bond Street, we now have a Chinese garden and try to honor the heritage of those immigrants. There are still many, many Scandinavians, and a lot of Astorians are very proud of their Scandinavian heritage. We have a Scandinavian festival every year in June, and this is a picture from the Shanghai in Astoria production that every year you can go hear people sing and dance and tell the story of Astoria's fishing and canneries. You can always tell a fisherman's house, crab pot floats. And then I want to finish with this beautiful image of a replica of a burial canoe from the Chinook or Clatsop culture, which is up high at the top of the hill in Astoria where the Astor column is, and you can see the beautiful Lewis and Clark River beyond. Thank you.